Good morning. How are you doing this morning? I hope you're doing well. We are in a series called I Believe, and I am Pastor Luke Hughes, one of the teaching pastors here at Midway Church, and we are stoked that you are here this morning. When we approach this series, I Believe, just get you a little bit behind the curtain. We originally wanted to call this series We Believe. We originally wanted to call it We Believe. We were talking as a teaching team, and we said, okay, well, this is the stuff that we as Christians believe. And we were talking through it, and we said, well, not everybody believes this. And so maybe the real heart of the issue when it comes to this series is, have you decided that I believe? That I believe, like we covered 2 weeks ago, that God is speaking constantly through his word, that I believe in the identity of God as Father and provider. And then today what we'll be looking at is, I believe Jesus, the Son of God, as God's Son and the representation of the Son in the Trinity. And so this morning we're going to be looking at God the Son. And we're going to be unpacking beliefs about who he is. But really, the ultimate thing that hopefully you'll discover this morning is, what do you truly believe, or what do you want to come to believe about Jesus? And so what's interesting is having conversations about fathers and sons already have unique relationships to begin with. Right? Like, I've been exploring this over the last 2 weeks with David. We've been getting him into regular pre-K over at Carrollton Elementary School, and he's been going the full day, and Dad's getting to do the whole drop him off early in the morning. We're both not like morning people, so that's just been super adventurous to figure that out together. You know what I mean? I go in there half asleep, he is asleep, and I wake him up, and it's funny because the other day Jessica brings him, actually, because they walk him up to the middle school, and Jessica brings him out to my car, and the other day he was walking funny. He's kind of like walking with a limp. And I said, oh, is David okay? Did he like get hurt at school today? And she says, no, you put 2 left shoes on his feet this morning. And they're the wrong size. It's like, winning, Dad win, and there was one morning we were driving down and getting close to the school, and I just hear him pipe up from the back, not super rude, just trying to get his point across. He said, Dad, I don't want to go to school today. Let's go to the castle playground instead. I said, son, we're not going to a playground this morning. We're going to school. And so he took it like a champ. He got quiet back there, and we got to the drop-off point, and teacher got him out, and I look back over the back door, and I see him getting out, and he didn't say anything. He just looked back at me, and his 2 eyes looked like full puddles of water, just standing there watching me drive away. And I was just like, oh, man, it hurt so deep. You know what I mean? I was like, okay, you can spend every day with me. And then I got about like 6 feet down the drive-through line. I thought about what that really meant. I was like, nah, you'll be okay. You'll enjoy school this morning. It'll be fine. But, you just get all these interactions of fathers and sons. I just wonder, am I psychologically damaging the child? But the other night, Jessica was in there, and I was watching like a creeper through the baby monitor. And he was in there, and they were playing, and she was saying, what do you think your stuffed animals are thinking? And she said, I think, Stitch is thinking about Lilo, and, he has a stuffed Jessie. Said, I think Jessie's thinking about Buzz Lightyear. He said, what are you thinking about, David? And he said, I'm thinking about Daddy. And all the fun we can have at the playground. I was like, yeah, that's right. You know what I mean? Because you moms understand, right? Dads get all the credit and you do all the work. But fathers and sons have interesting relationships. And we're going to unpack this morning more into the relationship of God as Son. And what I think is interesting about this process is wrapping ourselves around something that I think we struggle with as a question of faith regularly. And it's this idea that when it comes to learning about faith or being certain of our faith or growing in our faith, for many of us, we have an expectation of what that behavior or what that process is supposed to look like. And for many of us, what that process is supposed to look like something altogether otherworldly or odd to our normal everyday life experience. So if you're gonna experience God or you're gonna grow in your faith, you've gotta fast for days or pray for hours. You've gotta sing a zillion praise songs and really cry and mean it. And that's how you grow in your faith. I think for many of us, we think that in some way to get closer to God or to become more aware of the experience of who God is, that there has to be this altogether different thing that we do with our lives or experience with our lives to grow in our faith. And the question I want us to explore this morning is that actually true? Or does God, perhaps God, has wired you and I to grow and become closer to him and know him more through some of the most impactful patterns and relationships you already have learned to grow and know in your life? Because see, if I said you had to experience something altogether odd and otherworldly to learn how to change your oil or change a tire, you would look at me as if I was bizarre. Because if you're like me, I had a guy named Zach Thomas. He manages Chick-fil-A's now over in the Rockmart area, but back about 8-9 years ago, he was my college minister down in Columbus, Georgia. And the reason I know how to change a flat tire is because one day I was driving down the road. Jessica was with me, and for some reason we were driving separately, but she noticed that my tire had gone flat. And we were actually on my way to the little town of Edison, Georgia, because my granddad, we're actually going to bury my granddad. And so we were on our way to do that. And she noticed that my tire was flat and called me on the road and said, "Hey, you need to pull over, your tire's flat." And we were probably about 5-10 minutes outside of Columbus at that point. And so I pulled over at a quick stop, and I had no idea how to change a tire, but I wasn't gonna tell my girlfriend of the time that. And so I called Zach. I said, "Hey dude, I've got a flat tire. I know you've got that power lift thingy for cars. If you could bring that power lift thingy to my truck, I think it would be easier to change the tire." And so he came driving down there, and through a process and through steps, we changed the flat tire on my truck, showed me the key to unwind it, get the tire to come down. We changed it all out and got it all ready to go. And I didn't think anything of it. I was just grateful for the help and grateful for the experience and being able to get to my granddad's funeral on time. Until 3 years later, when I was in Los Angeles, California, and it was the night before my first day of seminary. And I had done the wise thing and stayed out till about 1:30 in the morning with a bunch of my friends. And so the next day was gonna be my first day of seminary, and I was driving home at 1:30 in the morning, and I started to hear this ka-thunk, 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 ka-thunk on my truck. And so I pulled, luckily I was close to the parking lot, so I pulled into the dormitories and parked and got out and looked, and sure enough, there was a massive road bolt stuck in my tire. And so I went and I got the lift kit and I took it out and I went and I undid the tire from the back, and at 3 a.m. in the morning out there with a flashlight, I changed my tire. And the reason I knew how to change my tire for the first day of seminary the next day, and even though I was tired, I made it on time, was because someone had stood with me shoulder to shoulder, knuckle to knuckle, and shown me how to do it. And see, I would venture to say that for many of us in this room, the reason you learned something, the reason you were educated on something, the reason you developed an understanding or an opinion about something, it would less to do with the information and informing yourself and more to do with the relationship that embodied it and invested in you to produce who you are today. And see, this is the way that we grow and experience and learn things. And perhaps the reason this is most consistently impactful in your life is because God wired you exactly to be that way. And when we seek to grow in our faith, for some reason we dismiss all of that as too natural and say something otherworldly and unnatural has to happen for the needle of my life to move in my journey of faith. As we look at this question this morning, I invite you to open up to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 4 a little bit. We're going to be in Colossians 1 a little bit, but we're going to start in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. The first thing I want you to see this morning is that Jesus is, as the Son of God, fully human. Jesus is fully human. This is Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. It says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with great boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." See, Jesus is fully human. Let that sit with you for a second. He didn't appear human. He was human. That he took on the physical limitations of a body. That he took on the limitations and succumbed to the natural forces that you and I are a part of in this world. That Jesus, if you go by the average height of the time, was probably about 5'5". So he still had an inch on me, but most of you were probably taller than Jesus. Which is funny because you should probably do some counseling about this, but I always thought that Jesus had to be taller than me, right? Because he always talks down to me. But Jesus was human. He had to eat. He had to sleep. He embodied all the experiences and the aches that you have experienced. Jesus was fully human. You know, I went to the Holy Land a month ago, and it was a super surreal experience. People have asked me, what was it like? And really, it's kind of hard to put into words because you're just seeing all these things that you've read about and thought about. And in a lot of ways, I know it's been like a month and a half, but I'm still processing a lot of what I saw. But part of the thing that was really impactful was, we went to the Sea of Galilee for about 3 days. And you're walking around the Sea of Galilee, and you're going to all these places that Jesus was at. You know, like we went to Capernaum, and we walked in the streets of first century Capernaum, and there in the city where they've excavated the city, there is the first century synagogue, like the stones to the first century synagogue of Capernaum. Capernaum was the headquarters of Jesus's ministry. And so beyond a shadow of a doubt, I know that like this 100 square foot area that Jesus, the Son of Man, Jesus, God in the flesh, stood in that area. That his voice echoed off the stones of that synagogue. That cornerstone sitting right there, marking out where the synagogue was. Why? Because he was fully human. right? Like we went to Jerusalem and they've been excavating over the last few years, and underneath the city, they've actually excavated down through some tunnels to the layer of the first century stones of the Temple Mount. So they actually have there in the bottom in a tunnel excavated to the street level of Herod's temple, which is where Jesus and the disciples would have come walking down the street, and the disciples would have said, hey, Jesus, look at all these amazing stones. And Jesus said, don't be fooled by all these amazing stones. Not one of them will be left on top of each other, because this city's gonna fall. And these are the stones that they would have walked down. And it's just surreal to know that in flesh and blood, just like my heels tapped the stones, Jesus's heels tapped these stones, that he walked and he thought just like you and I do. And why is this important to grapple with? Well, it's important to grapple with if you look back at the verse. It says, now we have a great high priest. The priest in the Old Testament wore this big plate on his chest, and it had 12 individual stones. Those 12 individual stones represented the 12 different tribes of Israel, and those stones represented the people. So the high priest literally represented, in the presence of God, the people of Israel. So a priest is a symbol for the people. And so it says, now we have a great high priest. Jesus is representative in the same essence as us, his people. He physically symbolizes who we are. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are. Don't rush past, has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. This representation, Jesus, our great high priest, sympathizes and has walked in our shoes, and God can understand what it's like to ache and desire to choose his personal desires over the plans of his Father. Now, he did it without sin, but he understands the ache inside of you to go with your own heart and your own mind instead of the will of the Father, to go with the emotional and the DNA and the urges inside of you instead of trusting the Almighty God to lead his life. That he was tempted in every way, but was without sin. And the writer of Hebrews reminds us that he is not unable to sympathize with us. And so in our moments of greatest need, in our moments of greatest ache, in our moments of greatest pain, we are to come boldly to him because he has experienced what it's like to be one of us. Jesus is fully human. The second aspect of Jesus that I want us to get this morning is that Jesus, as the Son of God, is fully God. Jesus is fully God. Hebrews 4, going back up to verse 1, says this: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And so he became as much superior to the angels as the name he had inherited is superior to theirs. Going over to Colossians 1, verse 15. Colossians 1, verse 15. Paul says it this way in Colossians 1. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in all things, these things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything Christ might have the supremacy. See, Jesus is also fully God. Now, don't miss this, because Jesus is 100% human, but Jesus is also 100% God. Jesus is a 200% kind of person, 200% Messiah, 200% Lord, because he is fully human, but he is also fully God. He is not 50% human with diminished aspects, including 50% aspects of God. No, he is fully human and fully God, which the ancient church fathers called this divine tension that resides in the incarnation. So this divine moment where God came to earth and was both fully human and fully God, and the word we give that is incarnation, God in the flesh. In fact, the early church fathers, they took a Greek word out of some text, and they used this word homoousios. Can you guys say homoousios? Homoousios. Homo means same, and ousios means essence. And so what they wanted people to understand was that Jesus was of the same stuff, the same essence, the homoousios of the Father. He's of the same stuff. It's the same idea that Jesus is using when he says it sends another counselor. Homoousios, the same stuff. That's what it's saying in Hebrews 4 when it says he is the exact representation. Or in Colossians 1 where it says that he is the image of the invisible God. And see, what is interesting is people detract from the idea of Jesus being fully God. Because we're all right with Jesus being a kind of a good dude. But if he's fully God, then we have some issues. And it's so funny because I thought, we all kind of get tempted to think, oh, this is just a dated conversation. But I had a conversation this week with a group of people that young adults are interacting with and dealing with. And one of the main qualms that we're kind of having to work through theologically with some of these groups is the idea that they just think that Jesus is another guy. And so the idea of Jesus being fully human and fully God is an issue. But the problem is that the scriptures testify that he is fully God. If you think back to the leper that was healed by his friends that brought him and opened up the roof and lowered him before Jesus, Jesus looks at this guy that is lame and he says, your sins are forgiven. And Jesus' enemies make the point for us. They hear Jesus say that this guy's sins are forgiven, and they say in the background, well, only God can forgive sins. Who does this guy think he is? Only God can forgive sins. And so Jesus in that moment looks at them and says, well, what's easier to say, that your sins are forgiven, or take up your mat and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins, or by definition is in fact divine, then this guy is going to take up his mat and walk. And he picked it up and he went home walking. Later on, Jesus was having a theological discussion with some of the religious leaders and some of the people, and he said, Abraham longed for the day that I would come. And these guys are kind of like popping off at Jesus, and they say, oh yeah, you're not even 40 years old, but you know Abraham. And he looks at them and he says, listen, before Abraham was born, ego eimi. He says, I am. Before Abraham was born, I am. I am is the divine name of God. Ego eimi. I am. And so Jesus in that moment is saying, listen, he is ascribing to himself the divine nature of God. And those guys were mad. They knew what he meant when he said it. And so time and time again, we find verification in the scriptures, both theologically through the church fathers, but also through Jesus himself, that he viewed himself as being fully God, both fully human and fully God, this divine tension within the incarnation. And the great struggle that I think people have with this is if Jesus really believed that he was God and people really hold to the fact that he was God, we can't just admit that Jesus was some good teacher. See, it's one thing that, like Buddha was, you read his writings, was a good teacher. That, all the gurus from Sikhism, that they were good teachers, for large part peaceful people looking for the good of humanity. They're Confucius, peaceful guy. Like, all these different teachers were good people. But the problem is, if any of those good people then say to people with conviction that I am the Almighty and the Alpha and the Omega, we get kind of creeped out. And then on top of that, to think that you're God, to think and say, I'm the ruler of all things, I created all things are held together by me and in my being. To then say, and you need to devote your few years to me. Well, that's kind of like on the narcissistic level of like a Charles Manson, if it isn't true. And see, the great struggle is if we accept, and this is why people argue with and try and dismantle the idea that Jesus was 100% God, is if we accept Jesus as being 100% God, we have to truly wrestle with the idea and the claims that he made to have call and ownership and bringing us into his kingdom and bringing us into his way of life. Jesus was fully human. Jesus was fully God. And finally, Jesus is, as the Son of God, fully relevant. Fully relevant. And relevant is a trendy word today. You know what I mean? Like, everything is relevant, especially in church world. You know what I mean? We even have Relevant magazine. And the whole point is like, I don't know, it's to be relevant. But relevant really has a definition, and it means appropriate to the purpose. Appropriate to the purpose. So Jesus being fully God and fully human is appropriate to the purpose. It's appropriate to the purpose. Colossians 1, continuing on, 18 through 22 says this: For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death, to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. You see, you and I have a problem. And if you're like me, you can understand where I'm going with this. See, I struggle with things in my life, and one of the biggest things I try to do is I try to correct myself and self-correct it and move forward, but all that ever seems to do is get myself in the way of moving forward into the things that I want to do better. Like, I'm my biggest enemy. And what I find time and time again is if I try and fix my own brokenness, all that happens in those moments is things end up more broken. And the great problem with this idea is one day I live with this fear, maybe you live with this fear. One day I'm afraid that I'm gonna wake up and I'm gonna be 82 years old, or I'm gonna get hit by a bus tomorrow. And what I'm gonna realize is that I was the same selfish slob that day that I feared I would stay for my entire life. But anytime I, in my own power, try to fix that problem, it just doesn't seem to get any better. And then that frustrates me, and I quit and go away for a while. And the great struggle in this process is that I know I was created for more, but I just can't seem to ever get to the point, whether through conviction or through religion or through self-help or trying a little harder, to be the thing that I was created to be. And it all falls back on me, because I like to choose me way more than I like to choose the thing I was created to be. And see, the great thing that we realize in Jesus being fully relevant is this: that Jesus came to unravel and unpack that great frustration and great failure in your and my life. That what if perhaps God, knowing how you are most wired and the way you are affected over long term and truly changed for longevity, wired into you the thing that is the mechanism by which you can truly change. So that when you come to God, it's not some religiously gimmick conversion or trick to get you start to do something to make you a better person, but you come in line with what you were created for, finding trust and truth in the God that created you, so that you find you are actually starting to live the life through a process of trust and grace that you were created to live. See, Jesus is fully relevant unto this task. And let me explain to you how. I was like 22 years old, and most 22-year-olds are pretty selfish, right? I was pretty selfish. Me and Jessica started dating when we were 18, right? Senior year, we started dating, and I didn't know we would eventually get married, but we started dating, and I was a pretty selfish person. Like, we had this super sweet part of our love journey, and it's that we actually never said, I love you, until about 2.5 years into our relationship. We dated for about 5 years. It's probably about halfway through that process that we started to say, I love you. Before that, it was super awkward to hear us talk on the phone, because it'd be like, I like you a lot. And now that had two reasons, okay? Because the noble reason, which was I really believed in love. And so if I was gonna say I love you, I actually wanted to mean with force what I was saying. Right? So I wanted to mean I'm sacrificing for you. But the cowardly side of that conversation is I also wasn't really ready to commit. And so I didn't, the reason I could say, I like you a lot, was I like you a lot wasn't I'm willing to sacrifice for this relationship yet. And so as we were growing as a couple, there were bumps and bruises along the way like everybody has. But I remember we had two close friends, and they were married and they got divorced. And so in that moment, I had to wrestle with, okay, what does it mean for me to actually love someone? And I remember exactly where I was. I was in my completely filthy kitchen of my sophomore college apartment, standing there, amongst all the frozen meal boxes and the dirty dishes. And I was just standing in my apartment. I'm sure I looked like a freak, because I was probably just staring at the floor thinking about these things. But then I realized something, that if I was gonna truly love Jessica, I was gonna have to give myself fully, my life, to her. Because in matters of love, the only way you truly love someone is if you're willing to go yourself. Is if you're willing to go yourself. And so I thought that, and I thought, okay, so what I think I figured out is this: that if I'm gonna love her, I have to make the decision to love her regardless of if she loves me. And so from that moment on, I wish it was much more grand, that I was standing in front of the Grand Canyon, but I was in my sophomore dirty kitchen. That's what I devoted myself to in our marriage. I said, I will love you. I will show up, because love always goes itself. Love offers itself. There is no representative that I send in my stead into my relationship and into my marriage to protect me. I have to go myself. I have to offer my heart. I have to be willing to step in 100%, regardless of if the other person is willing to come 1%. And when I do that, that means I truly love them. Amen. That means I truly love them. See, Jesus is fully relevant because in matters of love, you have to go yourself. Amen. And God loves you. God is crazy about you. God desires more than anything in the world to put you back together into the thing that he created you to be. But in matters of love, you have to go yourself. Colossians 1:21 says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Because in matters of love, you have to go yourself. See, God offered his body for you and for me. That our evil behaviors, our evil attitudes, our selfish ambitions sent Jesus to a cross where the fully human, fully God man yelled out at a cross that, why are you forsaking me, God? Why? Because in that moment, the fully human heart of Jesus and the fully God will and power in his life was divorced from each other because sin brings separation. Sin brings brokenness. And though he had never sinned, he was separated and divorced for ours. And listen. Being in the exact representation of God. The writer of Mark didn't want you to miss it. The Roman centurion, the enemy in the place, the one that had no business understanding, looks in this moment and in the divorce of the human and the divine, in the great act of love and sacrifice of a God who chooses to go himself, looks and sees Jesus, this first century peasant, dying on a cross, and he says, surely this was the Son of God. Surely this was the Son of God. Because in matters of love, you have to go yourself. Jesus came so that you would understand, not by some holy tricks or legal litigation that you could be in right standing with God, not by some crazy commandments or some special incense that you had to burn, but that a physical hand and the physical heart of God could reach out to you and put you knuckle to knuckle, shoulder to shoulder with the creator of the universe so that you could trust and know him. And see, when you step into that relationship with him, I promise you, your life will change. It's not tricks. It's not empty religion. It's knowing in the same way you have known and grown and developed in your life with physical people around you. Now the holy God of the universe wants to do the same in your life. Because in matters of love, you have to go yourself. Hebrews chapter 4 says it like this again. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, and this is his name, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, because he came himself. but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet is without sin. Therefore, let you and I approach the throne of grace with great boldness. Why? Because when we are broken, when we are in need, when we are hurting, Jesus came himself that you could be brought into a trusting, life-changing relationship with God. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That there have been great teachers and peaceful peoples throughout the world that have wanted the good of humanity. But Jesus is altogether different. Because in Jesus, God came to say, I love you himself. That you would not have to wonder what he looked like. That he, Jesus, is the exact representation of God. And I just want to invite you this morning. Jesus tells those that desire to follow him, if you'll just trust me with your life, I will come shoulder to shoulder with you, knuckle to knuckle with you, and begin to change your life from the inside out. In fact, the scriptures tell us that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the homoousios of the Spirit, the same stuff that is in Jesus, the same stuff that is in the Father, will come to reside inside of you and change you from the inside out. If that's you this morning and you want to start your relationship with Jesus, would you just pray something simple to Jesus? Just ask him to come and be in your heart, that you want to trust him, and ask him to lead you in that way. Maybe you pray something like this: Jesus, thank you for loving me. And thank you for offering yourself for me. I want to follow you now. I'm open to you showing me the way. In your name I pray.